You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
One guest that we love to have on is John Hoptak. John's a ranger here at Gettysburg, a fine historian, a really nice guy, and he has a particular interest in, he has an interest in a lot of things, but one of the interests that we share is the 54th Massachusetts. I think everybody is kind of enamored with the 54th Massachusetts, thanks to Glory. But as I was saying to John the other day in the parking lot, I said, the movie makes us love them and makes us interested in them. But then when you start to hear the truth about them and how much the movie either gets wrong or completely omits or totally changes, it makes it all the more interesting because now it's like, oh, I fell in love with this story, but here's the real story and there's more to it. And I don't know, there's something that happens in the brain when you when you learn about something that way that I think, I don't know. I think it kind of actually ignites a passion a little bit easier. At least in me, it does. So John last year did a winter lecture called On Freedom's Tenuous Edge. And it's about the African-American community here in Gettysburg during the battle. And it was very good, very interesting. It's this history that it only kind of like on the periphery makes it into the books. It's almost as if it was not almost. I mean, it was basically a parallel world, a parallel culture, and a parallel society that was going on at that time. And so John did a great job with it. I asked him to come on the show and talk about it more. And so here is our discussion about the African-American community here in Gettysburg. John Hoptak on Freedom's Tenuous Edge over at patreon.com/addressing Gettysburg. Happy holidays. Okay, everybody, welcome to Addressing Gettysburg. This is our special Patreon content. And I'm sitting here with Bob Steenstra, who is just kind of sitting in to listen because our guest today is, sitting in to listen, but also you can speak, Bob. It's not.
Well, thank you, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. And our guest today is John Hoptak, who is a park ranger in the education department here at Gettysburg National Military Park. And last year, Bob and I went to see a winter lecture given by John called On Freedom's Tenuous Edge, and it was about Gettysburg's African-American community before, during, and after the battle. And it was just so interesting. We asked John to come on and talk about it. So, John, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Matt. Glad to be here. Thanks,
Sure.
Bob.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
So, when we have a guest on, the first question we always ask is, why Gettysburg?
Mm-hmm. And that's a question I've gotten for a very long time. I remember I was probably 5, maybe 6 years old, way back in the early 80s when I came here for the first time. And there was something about this place that grabbed a hold of me, and it hasn't let go since. So my parents would bring me down here many, many times every summer, get the toy soldiers, we get the fake kepi, the fake musket, and there was something about this place that just appealed to me. And I can't really ever truly explain my fascination with the Civil War, with this time period, but it's always been there for as long as I can remember.
Mm-hmm. So it's more of it's kind of then one of those intangible spiritual things that...
Well, it's always been there, been a part of my life, like I said, for as long as I remember. In addition to Gettysburg, we'd go to Antietam, Manassas, Fredericksburg, Richmond, all the major battlefield national park sites here in the East Coast. And I was very fortunate also when I was growing up. There were television miniseries like The Blue and the Gray, and then there was
North and South,
and the Ken Burns documentary came out, and Glory came out when I was 11 years old, and still to this day, it's my favorite film.
Is it? It's your favorite overall film or Civil War film?
Overall film, Civil War film.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Was that Glory, you said?
Glory,
yeah. Same here.
Yeah. And I don't know it for sure, but I think I do hold a record for seeing the movie in the theaters for the most amount of times.
Really?
Because my parents took me to see it 7 times, and I caught it 2 more times this past summer when it was re-released. So
see, I missed that, and I didn't know about it until after the fact.
Yeah, it was re-released. It was very limited. It was to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the film. So they played it just on 2 different dates in July at select theaters. But
where did you see it?
Camp Hill and down in Frederick, Maryland.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. Oh, all right. Man, that must have been great because I saw it in the theater for the first time when I was 12.
Yes.
And I was, when the guy got his head blown off, I was like, oh.
Well, it's a memorable moment, I guess, for that. But
When you're that age, I think that might have been the first head blown off that I've seen. So,
but the movie, it's just like trying to explain what it is about this time period, this era that interests me. There's just something powerful about that film. Everything from the story that it told, of course, to the music. The soundtrack is just compelling one.
It's one of the best soundtracks out there. I agree. Yeah. Okay. So the African American experience here in Gettysburg, it's an interesting one. And as I'm finding, the more I read about Black history in the United States, it's almost like a parallel universe. While the overall events of American history are taking place, they have a whole separate history, a whole separate culture. Of course, not by choice. It's because it's imposed on them. But how easy is it to research and tell a story of, Gettysburg's Black population? Not forget about the greater population, but
the sources are there if you look hard enough, and I think that African American history is American history, and many of these stories are simply not as widely told and known. So there are a number of historians, amateur and professional, who have investigated this topic, like Margaret Creighton, Deb McCausland, and others. So it was based off their work that I kind of extrapolated or pulled for this topic. But you have to dig pretty deep. Go back to the original newspapers of the era, old census records for those who served in the military records. Their stories are there. It's just a matter of finding them. Mm-hmm.
So when you find them, then I guess let's go back to the founding of Gettysburg. Go ahead, give me. Were there slaves here in Gettysburg? I guess maybe we should do the backdrop of slavery in Pennsylvania first, and then go down to Gettysburg.
Yeah, well, when Gettysburg was first settled and founded, Pennsylvania was still a colony. And it wasn't until 1780 that Pennsylvania, a state now, passed its act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And that, essentially identified the means by which this institution would become abolished in the state now of Pennsylvania. I think in 1800, I take that back. In 1780, there were approximately 3,700 enslaved persons in this state.
Okay.
Within 20 years, by 1800, it had dropped down to 1,700. So the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery stated that anyone born to an enslaved person were to be free at the age of 28. Those, unfortunately, who were already enslaved prior to the enactment of that law were to be slaves for their life.
Why is that?
I don't know for sure entirely. Probably having to do with
because you bought
slave
it before
owner and property rights and
right.
all that.
Okay.
But there would be slaves still counted in the censuses of Pennsylvania up until 1840, I believe. So there were a number of very elderly enslaved persons, but. I say that because, when Gettysburg was first settled, among the slave owners, if you will, were the Geddes family. Alexander Dobbin, of course, whose tavern is still here, standing in town, were identified as slave owners.
Now, the Dobbins, he's a slave owner. The house is built. Today, everybody knows the Dobbin house for French onion soup. And how delicious it is.
And
but
the stop on the
but there's
Railroad.
Also, but second to that, once you go in there for the food, you find out that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. There's a little museum that they have up in the attic there that shows the experience of the runaway slave. During that time, during the Underground Railroad era, was the house in the Dobbin family still?
Well, there are those who believe that story is, maybe just a story. But it is
the Underground Railroad part, not the fact that he was a slave owner.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the Underground Railroad part of that. trying to identify with 100% accuracy stories about the Underground Railroad can be a tricky thing.
Yeah.
Of course, in an era when it was against federal law to assist in freedom seekers on their way north, there weren't many records kept, as you might imagine. So trying to pinpoint and identify precisely where and whom were Underground Railroad stations or agents is kind of a tricky thing. There's a gentleman, of course, one of the more prominent Civil War era African-American figures known as Basil Biggs. When he passed away in 1906, his obituary stated that he was an active agent on the Underground Railroad. And the obituary went into detail about how he would assist those seeking their way north, traveling to his farmstead, if you will, and he will place them in wagons, take them up to the Matthews family north of Biglerville, the Quaker area, to continue their journey. Okay. So that is the one source really we have on Basil Biggs. His obituary stated that he was an agent on the Underground Railroad. But as historian Tim Smith and licensed guide Tim Smith pointed out, it was 1858 when Basil Biggs and his family moved to Gettysburg. So that's only a few years prior to the outbreak of war, and not kind of the, you want to say, the heyday, if you will, of Underground Railroad activity. So if he was here for only a limited time, how active was he? These are the questions, So certainly, right. He probably was, he may have very well been, but you don't really want to keep a record of such activities while you're doing it because you're breaking the law.
Sure, yeah.
So the McAllister family also along the Baltimore Pike, Deb McCausland, she's done extensive work in the Underground Railroad and the Quaker Valley to the north, and she estimated that there could have been as many as 200 fugitives or freedom seekers that stopped for a time at the McAllister's mill. So.
I might just add, going back to the Dobbins, that there are records that will prove who owned slaves, because that 1780 law required you to register the slaves that you had.
Okay.
I remember doing research at the archives in Harrisburg a few years back, and being ignorant, I was shocked to see listed Alexander Dobbin's name. And indeed, if you go to the Dobbin House today, that little museum upstairs, I believe it's a will, perhaps a last will of the Right Reverend Alexander Dobbin, is on the wall up in that upstairs dining area.
Yeah.
And if you notice, it says on the list of beds and other property he owned, Negro. And there's more than one. Some of them, I think, listed by name. So if you do go to the Dobbin House, listener, go all the way upstairs and see those mannequins they have hiding there, showing you where they hid the slaves, supposedly. But also check and see that he was a slave owner, the Right Reverend Alexander Dobbin.
Right.
I don't know. Do you know who owned the house when it was supposedly a stop on the Underground Railroad?
Or even during the battle? Do we know that?
That I don't know. I'm sorry to say.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So do we know who the last slave to die in Pennsylvania was?
I don't know the last, but there was an obituary that appeared in 1858, I believe it was. I got to verify that date. But there was a woman. Hey, look at that. Look at that date, November 4th. So we're recording this on November 5th.
Hey.
She passed away on November 4th of 1858, a woman by the name of Patience Hack. And the Gettysburg Compiler was a newspaper that said that she may have been the very last slave in Adams County, certainly, but perhaps in the entire state as well. So that's 1858. She was around the age of 100, but that was just an estimate. The slave birth dates are generally not known.
Right.
Generally not known. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and what was I going to?
Can
next?
I just add something here? John, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the southern tier counties of Pennsylvania that had the highest concentration of former slaves.
That
makes sense
yes.
because before the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, all you had to do was cross the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania to obtain your freedom. Mm-hmm. So don't be shocked that it was Adams County that had quite a few slaves. Mm-hmm. Actually, Philadelphia, early on in the colonial period, had quite a few slaves, not necessarily agricultural workers.
And you can imagine, the route from Virginia, up to Shenandoah across the Potomac through Maryland, that little narrow finger of land there in western Maryland, and before you knew it was Pennsylvania.
Yeah. And so that kind of is a problem for Gettysburg and the surrounding area during the time of the Fugitive Slave Act, and you have patrols coming up trying to find runaways and things, so it could make it a pretty hectic if you're found harboring a runaway or something, right? Yes,
if you were found harboring or assisting in any way, certainly that Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was, one of the most, I don't know how to say it.
Horrible?
Yeah, terrible acts, and one of the most intrusive from the federal level, So this was requiring, free citizens to, even betray their sentiments to assist. But it was a tenuous edge of freedom, I like to call it, this southern area of Pennsylvania. There was a gentleman famously who lived in the southwestern part of town by the name of Owen Robinson, who was born a slave. He would carry his manumission papers with him at all times, just in case someone came up or something came up. Mag Palm is another famous story. I believe in 1858, Margaret Palm, who was born here in Gettysburg, raised here in Gettysburg, was almost kidnapped and captured, and perhaps the intention was to take her south to be sold into the institution of slavery. But she was able to fight back and rid herself of her would-be captors. So that's one of the more famous stories.
Yeah, how did she fight back? Did she bite him or something?
Well, that is one account. Yeah, other accounts say that there may have been a good Samaritan passing by, a gentleman who may have assisted, or perhaps they just didn't count on how strong of a person she was.
Right.
And she would later post to have her photograph taken. Bound with her hands, bound together to demonstrate how they were attempting to tie her up to be placed into a waiting wagon. So,
that's not the one? Am I mixing something up about? There's a picture of a African American woman. I think it's during one of the reunions down by the Fry Farm. Am I confusing? Is that her?
I'm not familiar with that. This is the Adams County Historical Society has the original image of Mag Palm.
Okay. So slavery ends. Gradually. You're right. What did slavery's demise in Pennsylvania do for Gettysburg's black population?
Well, as slavery would eventually just gradually disappear here in this Commonwealth, the population of African Americans in Gettysburg would steadily grow throughout the early 1800s. 1820 census record has the number at 108 individuals. By 1860, in the town proper, it was 186. If we expand that out to include Cumberland Township, areas where the battle would later be fought, we could estimate that a good 200 men, women, and children were African American at the time of this battle.
And what's interesting is that a good number of them were property owners.
Well, only 10%.
Okay, but that's still, from the 21st century way of thinking about that era, that seems big to me.
I believe that there were 20 individuals identified by a historian from Connecticut by the name of Peter Vermillier as being property owners, and you could find that information on the census records. And some of the more well-known or prominent African Americans here were property owners. People like Abraham Bryan, of course, whose home still stands along Cemetery Ridge. James Warfield, whose home stood where James Longstreet essentially established his headquarters nearby, and others that we'll talk about certainly as the podcast progresses.
Sure.
But about 10% of the black population owned the property on which they lived and the buildings in which they lived.
And I mean, you're talking Bryan and Warfield, those are pretty big spreads. It's not like you got a half of a duplex in town. We're talking farms, big pieces of property.
They were. Now, Abraham Bryan purchased that farm property in the year 1857, so that would have been 6 years before the battle came. It was a 12-acre farm. It was a rectangular shape between the Emmitsburg Road, the Taneytown Road, and during the battle, of course, it was overtaken by Second Corps soldiers from the Union Army, who essentially turned his stone walls into defensive positions, and his home into a headquarters for Alexander Hayes.
Right. And so
But 12 acres is not a large farm.
No, it's not a large farm, but again, I'm thinking from what we're led to believe the way the world was back then for African Americans, that he could own 12 acres or 12 feet of land. Like, where would he get the money? You know, like you thought, the perception we have is that they weren't allowed to earn, they weren't allowed to do anything, even if they were free, but that's not true. Not like life was great for them. I'm not trying to make that argument. I'm just saying it's a surprise to me that they were owning that. Now, he also had on that property, there was another house down by the Emmitsburg Road, right?
That's correct.
That he had a tenant in. Mm-hmm. Who was the tenant?
Well, in 1860, it was the Palm family. It was Joseph Palm and Margaret Devan, that's her maiden name, Meg Palm, and their child, who was 1 or 3 at that time, very young. Now, we don't know if they were living there at the time of the battle, but in the census records of that year, 1860, they were residing in that small home.
So during the battle, there was another building on that property.
That's right. Yep. And it was right along the Emmitsburg Road.
And so that's interesting, too. I didn't know that until I was reading through this. Mm-hmm. Okay. So now, and when did you say that Meg was kidnapped?
Almost. In 1858, I believe, is when the newspaper articles printed that account. Mm-hmm.
All right. So going back to the perception that we have of what was available for black people back then, were there opportunities for black people in Gettysburg or Pennsylvania in general, as far as like, you know, what could they do for a living? What was available for them as a career or a job or occupation?
Well, if you look at the census records, and again, Peter Vermillier did an account of this, and I drew a lot of my information from that study of the census records that he did. It was an analysis. The majority were day laborer and domestic servant.
Okay.
For the majority of the town's black men and women. There were others, Owen Robinson, who I referenced earlier. He was a restaurant owner near the corner of Washington and High Streets. John Hopkins was the very popular custodian of Pennsylvania College, earning $15 a month. Of course, today that's Gettysburg College. And Abraham Bryan, before he became a farmer and purchased that property in 1857, I believe he did work in town in a hotel. Don't know exactly what. It might have been a porter, but there were positions, there, but most were day laborer, or domestic servant.
Who was the guy that had a confectioner's shop?
Owen Robinson. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So he would sell, ice cream, oysters, and he had a restaurant going.
Ice cream and oysters. That's a
different times a year, I believe. Yeah, different times a year. Now, an interesting statistic also that's drawn out from the census records is that nearly half of all the black children of school age were indeed attending school. So that was something that was not available, to the Biggs family when they were living in Maryland. So Basil Biggs, his wife Mary, had children, and apparently the account is that they moved to Pennsylvania so that their children could receive an education.
So this was a segregated school, I'm assuming, right?
I believe so.
For black children,
Mm-hmm.
and it was in Gettysburg.
It was. I think it was just south of town, around Granite School Lane.
Oh,
but I'm not entirely certain about that.
Okay, that's cool.
And James Warfield, was he not a blacksmith and had a pretty good business?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, he was one of the more noted, one of the best known blacksmiths in the area. Mm-hmm.
And then Basil Biggs was a horse doctor, I think.
His occupations was farmer. He was a farmer, but apparently, like again, the obituary stated, he was also a veterinarian. Mm-hmm.
And he lived originally on the Crawford farm?
Yes. When he first moved here, he didn't own the property, but he rented the Crawford farm, which is just to the west of Seminary Ridge. So if our listeners are familiar with the Eisenhower farm, the area just west of the Longstreet Tower, that would have been the area of the Crawford farm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So is that still there today, in any way?
That I'm not entirely sure of. If it is, it's private property.
It's escaping me now. What was the name of the farm that Eisenhower that's now the Eisenhower farm? Who was that during the battle? Do you remember?
That too, it escapes me at the moment.
Yeah,
Beesecker, maybe?
That's it.
Okay.
I think that's what it was.
I'm not certain, but
I think that's what somebody told me. And if not, then maybe someone will write in and correct us.
Yes, please do. Please do.
Absolutely. Okay, so now as far as you've got guys that have restaurants and confectioner stores and a horse doctor and blacksmith, and how are the whites, like, how does the white population treat them during that time, the Civil War era?
That's a tricky question, because it would have been depending on the racial attitudes of the inhabitants. There were, like, the McAllister family, who were abolitionists, who were they fought for equality, the end of slavery immediately. There were anti-slavery societies that formed around this area that would meet at the McAllister Mill, and every now and then they would have anti-slavery meetings in the town itself. But I would probably say that the racism was deep among the white community, just like all throughout the North, certainly. And just because it was a free state by 1860. The rights of citizenship were not equal,
right?
So for them.
Well, and what boggles my mind is the story of there are a couple of white anti-slavery groups, organizations, and freed blacks wanted to go and join them, and they said no, whites only. Yeah, they claimed that they didn't want to draw any kind of unwanted attention to their organization. So in 1841, there were a number of black residents who formed the Slaves Refuge Society. And one of their founding resolutions was, "We feel it our indispensable duty to assist such of our brethren as should come upon us for the purpose of liberating themselves, and to raise all the means in our power to effect our object, which is to give liberty to our brethren groaning under the tyrannical yoke of oppression." There was a black anti-slavery society here in Gettysburg, but I believe there is an account of when one of the white anti-slavery groups met in the town. It was disrupted. Their meeting was disrupted by other members of the white community who, began to hurl insults and eggs and everything in their direction there. Because they were abolitionists. Yep. Mm-hmm. So the just cut this part out, Matt, because you got to go look for the thing here. You're talking
Matt,
about. Go ahead.
Since you're talking anyway, I don't want to jump in at places we're going to be going later.
Just jump.
But
that's fine.
I do want to direct it at some point to what's going on at the Warfield House today, if that's okay. I don't know when to work that in.
End. We'll do it because it's today. Okay. We'll do it towards the end. Just don't forget.
Okay.
Do you remember? Do you forget already?
No. Okay. Do you have a piece of paper and a pen I can borrow?
Yeah, here.
My pen and my pen.
Use the back of any of these.
Share that pen with you.
Okay. What?
Just to remind myself of questions to ask.
Sure. Go ahead. And you can just jump in too. Just raise your hand and I'll not talk. Where are we here now? All right, how about this one? So before we were talking about how a lot of the records, at least for the Underground Railroad and everything, are scarce. There's not many, if any at all. What about within the black community of Gettysburg? Do they have records? Did they keep records of their own history, or is it more of an oral tradition? How do we know a lot of these stories?
Well, I think a lot of the stories, of course, would be oral, being passed down through the years. If to find a lot of the written work, I used a lot of the newspaper accounts, the census records, and all that. So I know there's a number of current African Americans in Gettysburg who are very much continuing the history of the town, with various stories, accounts, and all that. And I believe there was an effort to establish a Black History Museum here in Gettysburg, which is still ongoing.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly
There's
where
actually
that
two
stands.
efforts.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
There's the old effort, and then there was like a break, and the guy who was spearheading the old effort has got his own thing going on, and I think that's the one that's going to happen.
We should have him as a guest sometime.
I'm going to, yeah.
Yes,
I almost invited him today, but I said, no, it's two different things. I'll have him come in on another time. But yeah, so So they do have that going, and I hope there is someday. I don't care who does it really, but I hope that someday there is a Black History Museum in town of note, like of some kind of, not of note, but of some kind of substance, not just a storefront, with like a couple of plaques and a photo album, but I'm talking like a real museum. Just, like on the level of the visitor center, something like that, like a real museum. Because it's, the history of, you can do it Pennsylvania, however you want to do it. But it's rich, it's deep, and it's a story that most of us haven't heard. And it was going on while all the stories we have heard were going on. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's fascinating to me. What got you into, because you have an interest in this? I
do, yep. And I've always been interested in the lesser known stories, the compelling fights for freedom, that narrative in American history. So this is naturally concurrently, even after 80 years after the Declaration of Independence, the fight for freedom was not done. It continued in various ways. And, there were, many people who continued that tradition in America, although they're not really known, you know, and I was happy this past summer, the Park Service offered for the first time a regular program dedicated to this story, to the African American history story. So I was very happy to see that and be a part of that also. My hope also is that, these stories can be told at the same time the larger battle story is being told,
right?
So that could be woven into the narrative of this place. So that's hopefully where I'd like to see that go.
And if I could jump in there as a licensed guide, since John's talk, that has been very helpful for me because I'm finding that some people are interested in that. Sometimes I'll point out, look over there, that house you see over there, that was owned by a free African American. And to me, there's something poignant about this attack being stopped on a free African American's farm.
Talking about the Bryan farm.
The Bryan farm, correct. Mm-hmm. And people, they often, you could tell by the way they react that, that is kind of cool.
Symbolic.
Right.
So, like I said, just trying to find those other stories that complement the general narrative, and so many books have been written about this campaign and this battle, but yet there's aspects of the campaign that still are underexplored. When we talk about when the Confederate Army came into Pennsylvania and how they were engaging in kidnapping black residents of their state.
That's what I want to get onto next. Yeah, go ahead with that.
It certainly was a reality of the campaign, but it doesn't get the attention. Most of the time we're told that the Confederate Army, quote unquote, behaved itself here, followed Lee's orders, kind of this lost cause thing, respect for property and all that. But there were a number of Confederate soldiers who were, looking for black residents of Pennsylvania for the sole purpose of kidnapping them. And there was a gentleman of the 23rd North Carolina. He wrote home as early as June 18th that he hoped to procure blacks in Pennsylvania, quote, for Southern exportation. And a soldier of the 4th Georgia Infantry wrote from Greencastle, Pennsylvania that, quote, we were on a regular raid, gathering up horses, cattle, and enemy stores. We have already captured a great many of each, besides over 100 Negroes. All are sent back as soon as they are captured, except such articles as are necessary for the Army. So there are Confederate accounts of this taking place, and there are a good number of accounts from white Pennsylvanians from Greencastle, Mercersburg, Chambersburg that talked about this practice of kidnapping black residents. And there was a gentleman from, I believe, Mercersburg, who called the Confederate invasion a regular slave hunt. So
the Jacob Hoke description that he gives in Chambersburg, he witnesses it, and that just talking about them chasing them into the wheat fields, and it's, and just to imagine seeing that happen to anybody. I mean, it's horrifying, and you're just being run down like animals. And then what was her name? She described it as like a cattle drive.
Yeah, Rachel Cormany, another resident of Chambersburg. So. It is there. I mean, these sources are there. These accounts are there. And I think if you dig even deeper into all the records, you'll find even more. But it's a part of the story that, quite frankly, wasn't even told at the time. A lot of the newspapers of Pennsylvania when they recorded Lee's invasion, they talked about the loss of property in terms of horses and farm instruments and all that, but barely touched upon, the kidnapping of black Pennsylvanians.
And that wasn't, so, I mean, no, do people actually deny that occurred?
I don't know if they deny. They'll probably try to minimize that it occurred. Mm-hmm.
So, but there was no standing order in the Confederate Army, round up black people so we can sell them. This was something more enterprising officers and units might have taken upon themselves. It could have been. It could have been also
something that a number of Confederate soldiers looked forward to because of violations to the Fugitive Slave Act. There was a resident of Mercersburg or Greencastle who asked a Confederate soldier how he could do such a thing. And the Confederate officer said that, quote, he felt very comfortable doing it since he was only recovering stolen property. So,
but a lot of these people weren't former slaves. They were born here. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So these are people who are freeborn that they're just ripping out of their life and taking them taking them down to the South to be sold.
And there's another part of this story, too, that I'm working on for my upcoming lecture, where I talk about South Central Pennsylvania soldiers who served in the 54th Massachusetts.
I can't wait for this one.
But from Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, there were as many as 33 black men who served in the 54th Massachusetts.
Just from Mercersburg?
Just from Mercersburg in that area.
Wow.
And that's right at the southern border of Pennsylvania. But they go to Reedville Camp in Massachusetts, and they're mustered into service in mid-April of 1863. So just 2 months later, in their hometown is being invaded by the Confederate Army, and whether or not they're aware of what's happening back there, but their families are there, while they're training to become soldiers of their own up in Massachusetts. So it's a compelling story.
It is.
And like you said, there are those who will try to minimize this. And the question is asked, well, who did it? And oftentimes a lot of people will say it was kind of the fringe element of Lee's army. It was irregular bands of guerrilla cavalry, not really reflective of the general army. But those two accounts I just read, those were soldiers in the army. The 4th Georgia, 23rd North Carolina.
And both in Rhodes's division of Ewell's Corps, which is highly believable because this is the first wave of the invasion. Right. Mm-hmm. And African Americans will flee. Correct me if I'm wrong about this, John, but later corps coming up might not have had the same visual proof because the African Americans had already fled.
Yeah. Yep.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So Rhodes Division, Ewell's Corps at the forefront, and Jenkins Cavalry Brigade also. A lot of the accounts have to deal with Jenkins Cavalry. But what's interesting, on July 1st of 1863, there is an order in the official records written by James Longstreet, and it's to George Pickett, who was bringing up the rear of the army. Mm-hmm. And that order told Pickett to report to Gettysburg and to bring along, quote, the contrabands for further disposition. Mm-hmm. Now, there were those who will argue that he wasn't referring to human being as contrabands there, but...
Wait, what's the argument there when they say, no, he wasn't referring... How did they argue that?
Well, it could have been anything, taken that would have been a military value.
Okay.
So horses or such.
Okay, so that was all... in that word, horses.
It could have been. It could have been. But that word contrabands, certainly has connotations. Dating, to the outbreak of the war.
Right.
So,
right. Okay. So
looking for military justification early in the war for the taking of slaves from slave owners, Northern general, is it Butler will use that word, contraband.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it before that, it would have meant military, not just military, but any kind of supplies. Mm-hmm. But he's playing kind of a semantic trick, sort of, to catch the Confederates at their own game. You call them property, well, then we're going to take your property and not let you use it for the war effort.
All right. So then would he's using it as a rhetorical weapon against them, but would a Confederate like Longstreet, would he refer to them as contraband? Because then...
the point is the word contraband could have meant...
No, I understand what you're saying, yeah.
And I think, to answer that question more definitively, we'd have to look at Longstreet's other writings, if there's anything else in his
the
correspondence, that would refer to human beings as contrabands. But Lafayette McLaws also, he hinted about this in a letter to his wife. He was talking about the order that Lee would send out to his army, that he expects the army not to disturb private property and all that. And Lafayette McLaws wrote that it is reported our army will not be allowed to plunder and rob in Pennsylvania, which is all very well, but it would be better not to publish it, as we have received provocation enough to burn and take and destroy property of all kinds, and even the men, women, and children along the whole border. So this is going back to this idea of the Fugitive Slave Act and how Northerners, in a lot of cases disregarded that, and the North became a safe haven to tens of thousands of those, seeking to escape from slavery. So, the accounts are there, but these accounts are not just often told, because they're not comfortable,
right?
They're not comfortable stories. They're not feel good stories, like that. But it's a part of this campaign that is there. So
then maybe it could have been that it wasn't a written order come down from on high, but maybe it was like, and if you happen to find some black people and you want to sell them.
Yeah, it would stand to reason that the high echelons would know that this was going on. Right. Rhodes certainly, perhaps Ewell, Longstreet even, we mentioned that, McLaws. Yeah. So it may have been known, but again, I always thought that Lee was very good at PR, so he knew how to say things that would work.
Right. Now, this is kind of jumping backwards a bit in time, but who is Eden Devan?
Yes. Now, this is a very compelling story, and there's a young man who just graduated from Gettysburg College named Andrew Dalton, who studied the Devan family, or the Devan family. You might hear it mentioned. The Devan family is two families really who lived in Gettysburg, Nelson Devan and Eden, and they lived very near to each other. So Sophia Devan was Nelson Devan's wife, and she was born a slave in Maryland. Nelson Devan purchased her freedom, and in 1847, I believe, or somewhere around there, he moved with her to a home that he built right at the intersection of the Taneytown Road and the Emmitsburg Road. So those of you who know Gettysburg today, it would have been directly across from Tommy's Pizza, near the Dairy Queen and the Gettysburg Toy Soldier Shop. That's where Nelson and Sophia Devan's family lived. Just a few hundred yards or so north of that along Washington Street, and just north of where the hospital is today, would have been Nelson's brother, Eden. And Eden Devan would become a property owner here in Gettysburg. And according to Andrew Dalton, he was the wealthiest black property owner. And a lot of his wealth was accumulated by purchasing properties along Washington Street and then renting them out to other black families. Okay. But Andrew Dalton, in looking into the story, found that Eden Devan may have also accumulated some wealth in assisting with fugitive slave patrols. So there's the McAllister family, Samuel McAllister, of course, you'll remember the abolitionist family. He talked that the slave catchers of the South had, quote, a most efficient ally in one of their own, in Eden Devan, who lived on Washington Street. And there's also a newspaper account that Andrew discovered from 1848 that talked about the stir that was occasioned in town when a slave owner from Frederick County appeared looking for a runaway of his. And it just so happened that runaway had, sought safe haven in Eden Devan's house. And at 3 a.m, he was pounced upon and he was, taken back. So
did she get money, or Eden is a he?
Yep, that's right. Yep.
Did he get money?
The newspaper account said that slave owner, quote, liberally paid his assistance. So,
but in general, is that why he did this?
You could argue that he did it because it was the law that he did it. That he followed the Fugitive Slave Act. That he didn't want to risk, losing the wealth that he acquired and all that. He didn't want to risk being brought, before a court. But I would say that there's a difference between if someone showed up in your back door and you offer them safe haven only to betray, the fugitive slave catchers. But the Devan story does not end there.
Okay.
Eden Devan will have a son who fought in the Union Army with, I believe, the 8th United States Colored Infantry. And he passed away in Texas in 1865 at a young age from disease that he acquired while in service. And Eden Devan actually then sold at a fair rate. He may have even donated 3 acres of land directly behind his home. And that's where the Sons of Goodwill established what is now known as the Lincoln Cemetery.
Oh,
so
cool.
that was Eden Devan's property behind his home, which is now the Lincoln Cemetery, where a lot of the African American population is laid to rest.
Interesting.
So Andrew Dalton's story about the Devan family can be found. It was published in a Gettysburg College journal, and I encourage all your listeners to look it up. You could download it. It's just an absolutely compelling story of 2 families, the Eden Devan and Nelson Devan. Nelson Devan, who was Eden Devan's brother, now he died in a work-related accident, which would leave his wife, Sophia, a widow, and by that point she had 5 children. And 2 of her sons would later serve in the United States Colored Infantry as well. One of them is badly injured at the Battle of Petersburg. Another is killed in action at the Battle of Olustee down in Florida with the 8th United States Colored Infantry. So you have these stories, and those stories. I mean, that's a movie right there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just there's a story there.
Oh yeah.
And I'm very thankful that Andrew was able to mine the sources to tell that story because it is a compelling one.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do we have an accurate, or at least a number, an estimate that we trust as to how many free Black Pennsylvanians were abducted?
No, the accounts vary, and it's kind of a tricky thing to guess. Some historians, like Ted Alexander, he studied this. He wrote an article. I think it appeared in North and South. A regular slave hunt is what he titled it. It could have been several score. It could have been several hundred. Kent Masterson Brown, who wrote a good account of the Confederate invasion, he also mentioned and talked about this and how he said, be careful when you look at some of these accounts, because some of these white Pennsylvanians may have been seeing the Teamsters that Lee's army brought with them, the 8,000 to 10,000 black men, mostly slaves, who were traveling with Lee's army and driving wagons and herding cattle and all that. And they may have mistaken them for Pennsylvanians who were, kidnapped and taken. So we don't have a precise number. Some of the accounts, a gentleman from Chambersburg said as many as 500. Another from Adams County said there may have been as many as 50 from Adams County alone taken, but we don't know.
Okay.
We don't know. We do know that a number of white residents fought back.
I was going to ask you.
Yep, there were those who would plead with Confederate officers for the release of a certain individual who was born a free person in a free state. In Greencastle, is that right, Bob? The account where the townspeople descended upon a wagon where there were a good number of blacks who were being taken south, but they would free them using tools and weapons from their home. When they noticed that this wagon was guarded by only 4 Confederate soldiers, they thought their time had come. So they would attack those 4 soldiers. They put them in the jail at Greencastle. And Albert Jenkins apparently discovered this, the Confederate cavalryman, and he galloped into town and he demanded their release of his soldiers, and he demanded that these black men and women be brought back, or else he's going to burn the town down. And short of that, he said he'll take $50,000 because that's what he thought he would have gotten, or they would have gotten on the slave market. But the town basically called his bluff. He never came back. He never carried out that threat. But there are accounts of that. And a lot of Gettysburg's black residents got word of what was happening, as Lee's army was coming north through Pennsylvania. So most of Gettysburg's black residents would flee before the Confederate army would get here, but not all of them. Certainly there were those who could not flee, whether from physical infirmity or advanced age.
Right.
There were those who decided to ride it out, hide, as best they could in town. Of course, there were accounts of black residents of Gettysburg being taken. And there were those who wanted to fight back. There were those.
Well, that's one of our Instagrammers. The question that he had was, did any Gettysburg African Americans offer to join the Union Army to help them fight? Do we know of any stories like that?
There are some stories.
Okay.
And there was a gentleman by the name of Randolph Johnston who was 22 years old when the war began. He wanted to fight. Of course, at that point, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, he was unable to, being a black man, but he still would raise a company of local black men, and he would train them as if they were a militia company or a military company.
This is at the beginning of the war?
At the beginning of the war, yes.
Okay.
And maybe even predating it a bit, but yeah, at the beginning of the war, at least, Randolph Johnston, a gentleman by the name of Lloyd Watts, would be in this spring up kind of militia company here. Without weapons, but still, he was called Captain Johnston, and apparently he wanted to go off in early June to fight with the famed 54th Massachusetts. Already by that point, close to 100 black residents from South Central PA had journeyed to Massachusetts, and Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania told Randolph Johnston no, that he would not permit him and his company of Gettysburg black soldiers to join the 54th because Pennsylvania was just beginning to raise its own black regiments.
Okay.
But we don't know. The interesting thing is we don't know what happened exactly with Randolph Johnston during the battle itself. But there are two accounts written by soldiers of the 12th Corps who fought on Culp's Hill of a black man joining them on the firing line. And one of them, a gentleman from Ohio, he wrote that on July 3rd, quote, an American citizen of African descent had taken position, and with a gun and cartridge box, which he took from one of our dead men, he was more than piling hot lead into the graybacks. His coolness and bravery was noticed and commented upon all who seen him. That was a gentleman, I think, by the name of Peter Cozzens of the 5th Ohio. There was another soldier in the 109th Pennsylvania, another 12th Corps unit that noted a black man wearing a belt, military belt, cartridge box, and he would do scouting work and let the soldiers know where the Confederate Army was. So was that Randolph Johnston? We don't know, but maybe one day we'll find out.
But we do have evidence of a black John Burns.
Yes,
right?
and that is the interesting comparison. If John Burns became a hero, he became a national celebrity because he joined the Union Army on the firing line. Well, there could have very well been a young black man from Gettysburg who did the same thing.
And John, thanks to your talk, since I go to John Burns, it's an old habit where I'll say, and that's the only local to pick up a gun. I'll check myself and say, no, he's the only white local, according to legend, who picked up a gun.
Yeah. And it would be interesting, if we knew who he was, would there be a monument? Would there be those stories? Would Abraham Lincoln want it to meet him like he did John Burns when Lincoln came to town?
Right. Yeah.
But Randolph Johnston would eventually fight for the United States. He would serve as a sergeant in the 24th USCT. So his name does appear on the rosters of that regiment. I believe he enlisted in 1964.
Okay.
So there is a good number of black residents of Gettysburg and the surrounding area who served in the USCT regiments when they were organized. So the 54th Massachusetts is famous. It's the first regiment raised in the North, east of the Mississippi River, during the Civil War. But most of the 54th Massachusetts did not come from Massachusetts. Most came from Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Close to 300 soldiers came from PA. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation, different states began to recruit USCT regiments, United States Colored Troops. And I don't have the exact number in front of me, but Pennsylvania would send over 8,600 black men to USCT regiments, which was a very large number.
These are before Pennsylvania raised them?
No, this was after Pennsylvania began to actively recruit USCT regiments.
Okay.
And there are a number of historians nearby, like Betty Myers, who lives in Gettysburg, Harry Matthews, who studied the black soldiers who came from this area, and there were a lot. There were, like I mentioned, Fleming Devan, who's killed at Olustee. He grew up right across from where Tommy's Pizza is today. His cousin William Devan died of disease. A young man in town named John Desnick goes to Camp William Penn, north of Philadelphia, and there he acquired a sickness that will take his life at the age of 21. The Buckmaster brothers, Isaac and Jonathan, both grew up in Gettysburg. They would fight with the 8th United States Colored Infantry. There could have been as many as 41 local black men from Gettysburg and its surrounding area who served in the USCT units. Wow. Which is, a pretty high number considering that the black population of this area, not as high as Philadelphia, was not as high as Pittsburgh,
right.
But still, that is a pretty good contribution there.
Would you say about 20% of the black population, if there were 200 at the time?
Yeah,
that is
absolutely.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And that 200 includes, men, women, and children.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty significant number.
Just speak more into the end, not the side, because you sound like you're over there. Okay. The African Americans who stayed behind for whatever reason didn't flee when the Confederates came, and then they find themselves in Confederate occupied Gettysburg. How did they hide? How did they escape detection?
Well, there are a few accounts. A gentleman, I believe his name is Isaac Carter. He was hiding in a woodlot for 4 days. So I think he worked for the Hankey family.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that out on the Mummersburg Road?
Yeah, up on the Mummersburg Road, north of the Peace Light.
How? I mean, I guess because it's behind the enemy lines by that point. So, but there's a hospital back that way, isn't there?
Yep. Absolutely.
So how is he hanging out in a wood? Because didn't he have like a couple of horses and a wagon or something?
He took some of the Hankey family horses. They asked if he would help protect them during the invasion, and he agreed to it, apparently. And I don't know precisely where it was, but apparently one of the young children brought him food, water, where he was in that woodlot. He wrote later, his account, I believe, is at the Adams County Historical Society. He said, if the rebels had happened upon him, they would have taken the horses and they would have taken him as well. So he was thankful that he was never discovered. There was another woman in town who hid two black women underneath the stones of her front porch. So underneath the wood planking of the porch, she would remove stones to slip them water, food during the course of the occupation of the town of Gettysburg.
And I know this wasn't during the battle; it was before the battle. But I think it was when Early came in. Didn't somebody hide a reverend's widow and her children above her kitchen or something in the house? I can't. The name escapes me right now. Is it Aunt Liz or? Yeah,
there's a fellow by the name of Albertus McCreary.
Yeah,
and he was 15 years old at the time of the campaign. He wrote his memoirs. It could have been about 45 years later. And he talked about his old, quote, washerwoman called Aunt Becky, who was taken. She may have gotten free, and the account is that she hid in the belfry of the Lutheran church on Chambersburg Street.
That's Aunt Liz.
Aunt Liz. Yeah, Aunt Liz. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Aunt Liz.
I don't think that was happening during the battle.
No.
Because the Confederate Army occupied that church, and there are accounts of the belfry and the cupola being used, by Confederate officers. So if she was up there then, she may have been up there when Early first came to town on June 26th.
That's what I have here. And then it was Mary Warren's mother who felt bad for a black minister's widow and child, took them into her West Middle Street home and hid them above the kitchen until it was safe to let them out.
Okay.
I mean, just think how hot that had to be.
Yeah, and we hear all the time, it's a very famous story, is that of Union General Alexander Schimmelpfennig and his exploits trying to get back to Cemetery Hill. His retreat was cut off, so he hid in Anna Garlark's woodshed behind her home on Baltimore Street, and there's a wayside panel and all that, but he certainly wasn't the only one hiding, during the occupation of Gettysburg. So.
Talking about Jack? Hiding in the haystack?
Or
Jack in the haystack?
Yeah, an elderly fella, apparently. These are, again, the records only have him as an elderly gentleman by the name of Jack, who would hide in the hay, for 4 days, very little food, very little to eat. Of course, this is an aspect of the campaign that the white families did not have to worry about. So white families who did stay in Gettysburg, they hid in their basements, but, come July 2nd, July 3rd, McCreary, for example, was out of his home. Sally Myers was helping with the wounded at the Catholic Church. They were able to essentially show themselves, Confederate soldiers coming by, occupying the town, but certainly the black residents didn't have that privilege.
Now, you mentioned Isaac Smith, his wife. She was not, well, I mean, I guess she was lucky in the sense that nothing bad happened to her, but she was being hidden by the Hankies, I believe, right?
Yes. Now, this is another account, and unfortunately, right now, I don't have precisely where I got this from. It could have been from the James Paredes book or the Margaret Creighton book, but there was a woman who was hiding in a basement behind some furniture, a black woman, and the home became taken over by Confederate soldiers. A number of the wounded men upstairs.
Right.
They asked the homeowner, a white man, if there was anybody in the house who could tend to their needs, being wounded and hungry, and he asked if a black woman would be guaranteed safety and protection if she did that.
The white man, Mr. Hankey.
That's right. Yeah. Or someone,
or somebody in the family.
And the Confederate officer said yes, of course. So that is an account. Now there's a part of that story that kind of rings a little
hokey.
I want to say it or anecdotal, or it needs to be kind of hashed out, so we find other sources kind of verifying that.
Okay. Now, before the battle, most would you say black people fled?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Did most of them return? Did all of them return? How many of them returned? And then what did they return to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to go back to the article that was written by Peter Vermillier, who looked at the census records of 1860 and of 1870. And of the 186 black men, women, and children who were living here in 1860, only 74 of them were here in 1870.
Okay.
So it stands to reason that most of the black residents of Gettysburg who fled during the campaign never came back. Because
just refresh me here. 186
in the town itself, in the proper town of Gettysburg,
in 1860.
In 1860,
of those, how many own property?
20.
20.
Yeah.
Okay. So 20, and then 76 return.
Well, there were only 74 still living here in 1870.
Got it.
Of that 186.
Of those, how many own property? Do we know that?
I don't know.
Okay.
That I don't know.
Okay.
But it would seem that most who did return were the property owners. People like the Warfield family, people like the Devan family, people like the Bryan family, Abraham Bryan. They returned to their property, just like the white property owners returned to their homes. And just, they would have found devastation, just the photographs of the Bryan farm post-battle say it better than I can.
Yeah.
The damage that was done to their property. That's the story that's famously told, but Basil Biggs, his property, the Biggs family, they fled as well. When they came back, it had been used as a field hospital, Confederate field hospital, being where it was located.
Right. And just to refresh everybody, that's over by the Eisenhower farm.
That's right. Yep. And the Warfield family's over there also. He lost his blacksmithing tools, were destroyed. So his way of life was interrupted. And the Bryan family also, the story is oftentimes told on Cemetery Ridge when we do tell a story of the Bryan family, how he itemized the damage that was done to his property. His tenant home was basically destroyed. His farm property in the year 1860 was valued at $1,400. Well, the damage claim that he submitted to the government was for $1,059. So it was almost a total loss. He knew exactly how many fence rails were destroyed, how many rods and stone wall were destroyed.
Yeah. Very meticulous.
He was. Yep. And I think it took 15 years, but he was able to get $15 in restitution to help him rebuild. The Warfield family had a different experience. They put in for $500 worth of damage, and I think in 1871 they received $402 for that.
Which that was the question that I had, is do we know why they got basically all they asked for?
Yeah.
And Brian got a joke.
I don't know. I don't know. I've had that question before, but there are other families like the Spangler family, Union Army Hospital. The Leister, Lydia Leister, not receiving anything, essentially.
So, and that's because that's the thing, is a lot of the white families didn't even get anything, or they got some kind of paltry award. But what was the government's policy on how they decided, who gets what? And
the old story is that, if you could prove to the satisfaction of the detectives or the inspectors that the damage was caused wantonly by the Union Army, by Union generals and all that, then they would be more amenable to restitution.
So Lydia Leister couldn't prove that.
I guess not. I guess her home was Union Army headquarters, but
it was damaged by the shells of Confederates. Is that what the argument would have been?
I'd imagine so. Yeah. I worked at Antietam for a while, and there was a large farm property there, the Muma family, and they lost everything. Just like the Bliss family here, they lost everything. Their house was burnt, their barn was burnt, and they were denied being told, allegedly, that they could not prove that the damage was done by federal soldiers, that, the house was burnt by Confederates. So it was a different time, a different world.
Yeah.
But I'm not convinced that race had anything to do with whether or not the family got anything.
Right. Well, it doesn't sound like it, because the whites got just as bad the
Warfield family they received compensation. The Biggs family would, in 1872, recover some damage from the battle. Mm-hmm.
So you got something there, Bob?
Just back to the population changes between 1860 and 1870. It's my assumption that the African American community here in 1860 did not have deep roots, apart from the names and we know them because they were property owners, right? So I'm thinking in any conflict where there's refugees of war and things like that moving, if I'm an African American who just showed up in Gettysburg sometime in the last 10 years because of the Fugitive Slave Act or even before, I don't have deep roots, and I don't want to be that close to the border.
Right.
So it doesn't surprise me that they're leaving.
So it's an invading Confederate army is a good excuse to leave and
just
go somewhere further north.
Yeah. I mean, the local white population, some of them did the same thing, not permanently,
right?
But they got their property out of here and tried to get out of here. So
makes sense.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, another question. Do we know where Abraham Bryan and family spent the days of the Battle of Gettysburg?
That I don't know for sure. Okay. I don't know. There are some accounts of black residents fleeing north just beyond Biglerville today. I think it was called Middletown at the time. There was a black community up there around the Quaker Valleys. The Quaker families, of course, being always sympathetic to the plight of the enslaved, of course, of fugitives. And we could just imagine them welcoming black residents into their home. Bryan may have gone there. Okay. But we don't know.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, that area was known at the time, sort of, and still today, Yellow Hill.
That's correct.
I've also don't remember where I've heard this or read this, but I've heard that some went to Wolf Hill.
Yes,
which is a pretty significant wildish area just east of Gettysburg. And so I don't know if that was true. I was asking if Bryan might have been there.
It could have very well been. And Tilly Pierce, who of course is a well-known resident, a young white woman who lived in Gettysburg, she left an account of the black community fleeing in the days before the Confederate invasion or the occupation of town. And there's almost kind of a hint of derision in her account. Sally Myers also wrote about it. She complained of the noise that was being made by these black men and women, children who were leaving town in a hurry.
You mean the noise of terror?
Yeah. And, Tilly Pierce said that invariably the flight of Gettysburg's black residents was down Baltimore Street to Culp's Hill, to that area. So maybe they continued on toward Wolf's Hill beyond that. It would make sense, certainly.
The other thing about Tilly Pierce's account is she quotes people, but she writes it phonetically. And it's I don't know, like with today's eyes, you look at it and you go, well, man, that's kind of racist the way you're writing this.
Yeah.
But I don't think at the time when she wrote it, maybe it would have been considered that way, or if it was, who cared at that time, But it's I don't know, it's almost like she's laughing. Like she looks at it as a humorous thing to watch. I think she even says that, doesn't she?
Well, she wrote an account, and we can't. It's hard to decipher, any kind of anything beyond what's written there.
Right.
But she talked about the bumping into each other, the tripping over one another,
right,
that kind of thing. And to go back to Bob's point also about the black residents returning to Gettysburg. Oftentimes when we study history, we know the end of it. So we know the war ends in 1865, and we know that the Confederate Army never again came to Gettysburg.
Right.
But they didn't know that in 1863, So being 8 miles away from the Mason-Dixon line, what if they do return and the Confederate Army does this same thing again the next year, So I think many would continue north through Harrisburg up to New York State and elsewhere.
It's also important to point out that since the war began, Gettysburg as a whole, the whole area as a whole, had been under threat of some kind of a raid or invasion. In 62, Stuart was right out at Cashtown, and he could have come out this way, but instead he decided to go south.
Yeah.
They had a lot of close calls.
Yeah, and going back to the Antietam campaign or the Maryland campaign in September of 62, Stonewall Jackson led his command into Frederick, Maryland, which is about 30 miles south of us here at Gettysburg, and he moved west pursuant to Lee's orders toward Harper's Ferry, but he told his soldiers to speak loudly enough so that the residents of town could hear that they're heading north to Gettysburg, so that their next target will be in Pennsylvania and probably be Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
Really?
So that when the Union soldiers began to arrive in Frederick, and they asked, okay, which way did they go? Did they say anything? Jackson was going west, but it seems like he wanted to divert Union attention north, and he said, he mentioned the town of Gettysburg.
Interesting.
I
didn't know that.
I didn't either. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, but being right here on the border, being the county seat of Adams County, certainly not as large as Chambersburg or certainly Harrisburg, but still a notable town.
Yeah, I mean, for the region, it's like an island in a vast sea of nothing. So, and all the
nothing.
Well,
That's
not nothing.
Pastoral farmland.
Okay, you know what I mean.
It's beautiful.
But I mean, if you're looking at roads and everything comes here, and everything in the surrounding area, there's it's nothing. There's just fields. So it makes sense that you would pick this place out on a map, because compared to between Frederick and Harrisburg, it's one of the few places where there looks like there's anything going on. So that makes sense to me there. So after the battle, they come back. They find that they're having the same issues with the government getting any kind of compensation for the damages done as the white people have. But then now comes the time to figure out what are we going to do with the dead of the battle, and the plans for the cemetery start taking shape, and the African American community has a hand in that as well.
Oh, absolutely.
In help. What goes on with that?
Well, just like the white farmers, the black farmers found their property converted into graveyards. There's a map. It's at the Library of Congress. You could access it at loc.gov. It's called the Elliott map that talked about burial locations. Some criticized the map as being, just too many graves. But between Abraham Bryan's barn and the Emmitsburg Road, there were 108 graves, according to this map, that were dug. And the creation of the cemetery occurred just months after the battle. And oftentimes when the story of the cemetery is told, we often hear about Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania, David Wills, David McConaughey, both Gettysburg attorneys, white attorneys. We hear about William Saunders, this immigrant from Scotland who designed the layout. We hear about Samuel Weaver, who tried his best to identify the dead, but we don't often hear about who was actually doing the work of removing the remains, the corpses from the ground and taking them to the cemetery. And among those who were doing that was Basil Biggs. And most of the men who were laboring in the fields under the supervision of Samuel Weaver were black men. So Basil Biggs became a supervisor during this project, this process. He would go to the Gettysburg train station, where piles of pine coffins, if you will, pine boxes were stockpiling, and he was only able to fit 9 of these pine boxes onto his wagon. And he would take that out to where Samuel Weaver was on the field, overseeing the removal of corpses from the ground. And 9 at a time, Basil Biggs would take the remains to the National Cemetery for reburial, final reinterment there. There's a photograph. Many of your listeners may know of it, but it shows Samuel Weaver with a book in hand, overseeing the removal of a dead Union soldier who was killed actually at the Battle of Hanover on June 30th of 1863, buried in a churchyard in Hanover. But the entire workforce surrounding Weaver were black men. So when we talk about the creation of the cemetery, that would not have been done without the work of the local black population,
right?
Doing that work. And they were compensated, of course, for that. But the question is, how much? Because we know the gentleman who got the contract, it was, I think, $1.51 per corpse taken to the cemetery. And that had to be split between the gentleman who got the contract and then Samuel Weaver, who supervised the reinterment, and all the laborers underneath. So we don't know exactly how much per body these men would have received, but they are a part of the story. But that part of the story is not often told. We hear about Edward Everett speaking for 2 hours. We hear about Abraham Lincoln, of course, with his famous address. But I want to kind of put a bow onto the story of the Devan family. That cemetery was created on the hilltop directly behind Sophia Devan's home. Right. Sophia Devan, when she came back, just like Abraham Bryan, the property was devastated. The roof was almost entirely shot away. All the dishes were smashed. There's a monument in downtown Gettysburg there to the 55th Ohio. So these were 11th Corps soldiers who were taking up position on her property, that 4-acre property right there. And that was the edge of the Union line right there at the foot of the Cemetery Hill. And they were battling out with Confederates who were posted in town in the southern tier of town. Southerners who were taking up position in Eden Devan's property. So the Devan property, again, is such a compelling story. But the dedication day of the National Cemetery was November 19th of 1863. Sophia Devan's youngest son, Fleming, enlisted on November 20th of 1863.
Okay.
Which begs the question, was he there? Did he hear Abraham Lincoln's words? Did he was inspired by that unfinished work and the great task remaining? We don't know. We don't know. But
the new birth of freedom.
That's right. That's absolutely right. New birth of freedom. Was he inspired by those words to enlist? We don't know. But the date is November 19th, dedication day. November 20th is enlistment date for Fleming Devan.
Well, and speaking of new birth of freedom, I mean, the Civil War, obviously, it ends, or it answers the question of slavery. It frees the slaves. And so I would imagine in future commemorations and memorial services and remembrances, the African-American community is included with much smiles from the white community. Is that correct?
Well, that is not the case.
It's not the case.
It's not the case.
I'm shocked.
The Civil War, for so long, the study of this war was dominated by this the idea of reconciliation, and look what the country went through, and look how it was able to recover. The country is one again. Shaking hands across the stone wall is an iconic image of this place. But left out of the story, the remembrances of the Civil War, is the black contribution. Many of these stories that we've told over the past hour or so are not often told. And sadly, it wasn't long after the war ended that, these stories began to get suppressed, and 1869, there was a Memorial Day ceremony at the National Cemetery. And the occasion called for the school children of Gettysburg to throw flowers on the graves of the dead of the soldiers, and everything seemed to have been worked out until a number of the white residents of town discovered that that also included the children of the black school, that they would be included in this ceremony. So they protested and say that, our children are not going to participate if black children are. So the black children were denied an opportunity even to participate in a commemoration of the Battle of Gettysburg at the National
Commemorating
Cemetery.
the soldiers who died that they could be free.
That's absolutely right. And
it's unbelievable.
Well, you certainly, and including many of the black residents too who died in the conflict. Let's forget like Fleming Devan and William Devan, John Disnick and others who served from the area and gave their lives. The editor of the Gettysburg Compiler applauded the decision to exclude the black children. He called it a triumph. And he said, white men of all parties and white children of all creeds will thank them in years ahead. But the editor of the Star and Sentinel fired back. He called it an absolute disgrace to the town of Gettysburg and the source of indignation and shame. He said to exclude black children from the ceremony was an insult to the memory of dead heroes of the Republic, including black soldiers who died in the cause. In the cause of the Union here and the freedom. So, yeah, like you mentioned, it wasn't long after the war ended that these stories began to go away. We don't, for so long, the story of the Confederate invasion was how well behaved the Confederate Army behaved here in Pennsylvania. But at the same time, there are all those accounts out there of what also was transpiring. But those stories are not told. We hear about, like I mentioned before, they're not always comfortable stories. And it seemed like for so long people didn't want to talk about them because of that, for fear of offending somebody in the audience or saying something that doesn't mesh with what they were taught, growing up. So, for those and other reasons too, and because, this whole reconciliation, lost cause narrative that began to emerge, the focus was on the healing of the nation as the lasting legacy of the war. Initially it was the story of freedom and liberation. It was the end of slavery. That was the result of this horrific conflict that drove the nation apart. But as the years passed, as a way to kind of welcome back, white Southerners and all that, that began to get replaced with this, kind of reconciliationist theme of let's all meet here on the battlefield. We could shake hands across a stone wall, and all is forgotten. That kind of thing.
I mean, I think I understand. That you have to reconcile with the dominant culture has to reconcile, right? And I understand that part of it. But I don't understand how you can do it and just act like none of this stuff ever happened. I mean, now I was a kid, so I mean, but when I first saw Glory, I'd always, as much as a 12-year-old could be into the Civil War, I grew up going to my aunt and uncle in Virginia, and my uncle's got stuff that he dug out of the yard, all over bookshelves and everything. And we'd go to battlefields and everything like that. And never once had I heard about this until the movie came out, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that. And I thought it was just one regiment.
Yep.
And then for years I went through, cause I wasn't really studying much. And then I got back into it, when I got back into Gettysburg, when I got back into the Civil War in general. And then I found out that they were one of many regiments. And it was a whole new history to me, which is exciting because it's something new to learn about, and it's not going to get stale. But yeah, I mean, it's just like, so, I mean, during the post-war years, let's say from the end of the war to 1960, let's say, was this stuff told at all, or these stories told, or acknowledged?
Oh, I'm sure it was told. Mainly, primarily, probably among black citizens.
But I mean, like in the culture,
in the larger narrative. There were those Union veterans who continued to push the theme of freedom. There were those Union veterans who talked about the sacrifices that they made and their colleagues made in the name of freedom and all that. But when it came time to tell the story of the Civil War at the 100th anniversary of it, the idea that slavery caused the war, it was relegated to just one of the reasons why, but certainly it was the reason why,
right.
And oftentimes I get asked, did slavery cause the war? And I'm like, well, would there have been a civil war if there had never been slavery? And the answer must be no, because everything is wrapped up in that institution.
Just look at their articles of secession and their state constitutions.
But there was a time when that was just kind of dismissed, and it was given as a contributing factor.
That's a huge thing to dismiss when it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Can I interject here?
Bob Steenstra with some closing questions here. You want to
some questions?
Round it out? Yeah.
Since we're on this topic, this is what interests me the most about this whole thing. And John, thank you so much for your work. Can you tell us, were there blacks at the 50th anniversary in 1913 of the Battle of Gettysburg?
At one of the big remembrances, it may have been the 50th, it may have been the 75th, probably the 50th, black veterans were excluded from participating. So again, to go with the reconciliation narrative, black veterans of this war were told, no, thank you, so
right.
It just began almost immediately. Well, not long after the war ended, that these stories are kind of brushed aside.
Okay. 100th anniversary. I've been told, I haven't done original research on this, but by a fellow licensed guide, that George Wallace, famed segregationist, made one of the keynote speeches, and that he basically was proclaiming the lost cause theory, and that this was not about slavery.
Yeah.
And it was suggested to me that might be a cause why parts of the African American community do not come to Civil War battlefields, because it was a pushback against that. Oh, this was a white man's war. It had nothing to do with us.
Yeah. And, of course, certainly the whole idea of monumentation, I think he spoke those words at the dedication of the South Carolina Monument.
Okay.
And if you read the reverse of that monument, most people see it from the tour road, just the front of it. But if you read the back of it, it includes excerpts from that, I think, or from a speech that talked about that. And it is very interesting when you contextualize the placement of these monuments in the era of the Civil Rights Movement, because you have the Virginia Memorial was placed in 1917, and that was against the objections of a number of white Civil War veterans who thought, well, why in the world are we going to be commemorating Robert E. Lee, on a battlefield where his decisions led to this and that? So there were white Civil War veterans who objected 100% to the placement of Confederate monuments. They weren't able to stop it, of course, but they were able, I believe, to at least not have the Confederate battle or flag on it. So when you see the Virginia Memorial, it's the Virginia state flag and not the more famous flag of the Confederacy. But those flags did begin to appear in monumentation by the 1960s.
Right. I think 1966, I think the Arkansas Monument is the first Confederate flag. And think about what's going on in 1966. Even the famous North Carolina Monument, 1929, there is a flag, but it's nondescript.
Yep, it's nondescript, absolutely. So this issue of monumentation is nothing new in our time of the 21st century. This was something that has been a source of controversy and contention for as long as they've been placing monuments. And we have to just imagine the context in which they were placed.
That's interesting. Yeah, that the placement of the monuments have as much to do as the time they were placed, probably more so than they do the things they're commemorating, right? Is that basically what we're saying?
Yeah, there's didn't been moratoriums placed on new monumentation, at national parks, because the monuments say more about us than about the people who experienced the war. Of course, there's no one alive to say what they would like to commemorate, like how they would want it to commemorate. So I think any new marker monument would reveal more about current politics,
sentiments,
than anything.
So then the ones that the veterans put up are probably the most most accurate
Yeah.
to what really happened and who they really were.
Well, sure,
that we could get, but they're going to have their own biases because those are put up 20-something years later. Yeah,
absolutely. But I do like, to remind, visitors that these monuments are, by and large placed by veterans. The text, what they chose to write, is as if they were speaking to you. So, they want you to remember their 13 fallen comrades or their 28 men who were wounded, because all these monuments seem to include casualties.
Sure.
So certainly that was a big reason why.
This had come up. Both of you had mentioned the term "lost cause," and for the benefit of people who are new to all this, what do you, when you say that, what does that mean? Either one of you. Don't jump at it. Don't, just slow down.
There was in 1866, there was an editor, I believe, of the Richmond Examiner who wrote a book called The Lost Cause. And it was essentially a history of the Confederacy doomed from the beginning, that they never had a chance against either superior manufacturing, technological advancements of the North, how the war was pretty much a war for states' rights and not for anything pertaining to slavery, a war that saw the end of a way of life, kind of this gone with the wind idea of what the South was before the Civil War came, before the North just, came and ripped that away.
So like they're victims, like this
almost,
poor martyrs, like type of thing, or is that?
And it came to dominate the Civil War history. It seems like every Confederate army everywhere was operating under disadvantage, numerical and all that, but yet they overcame the odds. If you walking up and down the streets of Gettysburg today, just look at the artwork that is still being made. It is by and large Confederate generals.
Yeah.
It's Lee, it's Jackson, it's Jeb Stuart kissing a child, bidding farewell to a wife. You don't see a George Meade, embracing his wife. You don't see a George McClellan, leading his men to victory like at South Mountain, or anything like that.
That's a really good point.
So all these different ways that you see this narrative, continues.
Why though? Why?
Well, I guess it's appealing. It's
because everybody loves the underdog.
Well,
is that
maybe
what
it's maybe a way to make sense of such a horrific thing, and you don't want to touch the extreme. The realities of the horrors of this war. So it's kind of a
romantic,
a step back, look at the more romantic side.
It's human nature to want to look at nobility, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is excellent or praiseworthy, admirable. And the battle is full of those kind of stories on both sides.
Sure.
And you hide, I think, the important truth of the awful side of things when you ignore the African American experience, or when you say that this war wasn't about them, that it wasn't about slavery. I'm not saying it was the only thing, but when I'm giving a tour to people who say, well, it was states' rights, I'll say, yeah, but you didn't exercise your right to secede over the tariffs that you say was what was really causing it,
right,
back when the Tariff of Abominations was passed. And that's part of the lost cause thing. It's minimizing, I think it's pushing it off to the side at the best, that slavery was an integral part of the cause of this war.
Is it maybe because it's easier to praise the noble and brave deeds of the Confederate soldier on the battlefield if you just washed over the fact that he's fighting to preserve slavery?
Right. And as a guide, it's tough to do that, especially when you have people coming here from the South,
right,
who had relatives fighting here. And I don't want to denigrate them either. I don't want to rub it in their face.
Well, no, because in all fairness, the average grunt did not own a slave, and he could not care less.
Right,
probably.
the vast majority of white Southerners are not able to afford slaves. Right.
So yeah. So for all the Southern sympathizers who just heard me say that they were fighting for slavery, I understand they all didn't own slaves. I get it.
Absolutely.
But I would say, the reasons why someone enlists not necessarily the same thing as the reason why the conflict began. you know?
Right.
Correct.
So, certainly we could recognize the sheer bravery on both sides.
Oh, absolutely.
But we can't ignore what it was that got this country just 85 years after it was founded to a point where it was in danger of collapsing, of failing. The United States of America would have lasted 85 years. That was it.
Right.
And then
would have been a footnote in history.
Certainly. So it's just interesting that, we certainly can look at the tactical genius of Robert E. Lee. We could look at the sheer bravery of that, and we could acknowledge that on both sides. These were incredibly brave individuals caught up in this horrific moment in American history, which Abraham Lincoln said was a test to see whether or not this country of ours can indeed work. Can this idea of the United States work? That's what this war was being fought for.
And no one can help but shape the narrative by what is going on in their current time. Case in point, now I tend to emphasize the human cost of this war.
Yeah.
When I'm trying to get people to get to know individuals who died here. And with the point being, if this war was fought today and we're in a very divided America, there would be 6.22 million dead at least. And some say the Civil War casualties could have been as many as 750,000, which would mean 7.5 million Americans dead. And the reason for that I'm bringing that in is to say, let's
calm down.
Well, yeah, let's calm down. Let's see the humanity of those on the other side of the political divide and not get to a point where we can't compromise. Because the only time in our history we couldn't compromise, this is what happened.
It's a great point. And I have, friends who are all into, that I met through Gettysburg, through an interest and a love of Gettysburg and the history and studying it and all that stuff. And every once in a while, they'll say something in reaction to something that, say, Antifa does. And they'll say, man, I can't wait for this war to start so I can take a few of them out. And I say, are you serious? Like, do you not understand what the reason we even know each other? And do you think it's just a cool place to visit, like that's got pretty orchards and barns? Like, is that all you see? You don't understand the cost of it and what really occurred. It's a horror show. And who wants that? Who wants that? So yeah, I know what you mean. Like it's every generation looks at things. What is it? The Jim Weeks book? Did you ever read that? At Gettysburg, what is it called? In Memory and Marketplace or something. And it's basically about how every generation, the tourism of each generation. And it's interesting to look at how each generation looked at Gettysburg and presented it and the lessons that they drew from it. And it is you're right, like you're saying about the monuments. The monuments say more about us than they do about them. And that's why we shouldn't have anymore. So I agree.
Last question about monuments.
Yeah.
John and I have talked about this before. I've asked him this before. As far as I know, and I'm certain about this, there are no monuments to express the African-American experience at Gettysburg. I can think of some. I've been trying to light the fire under some people to see if we can't get a monument here. But my problem is, for you listeners, I'm white. But John, I've asked you this before, but if you could put one monument up here at Gettysburg to represent the African-American experience, what would that be?
And like when you asked me the first time, I'm having a difficult time. But after some reflection, if we are able to verify that it was Randolph Johnston who joined the firing line, I think that monument would be a good one to tell a larger story. But there's so many. Yeah, it's just perhaps that.
I like that one because you got John Burns. Why not have this one? And do we have to know that it's him for sure? Couldn't it be a generic one? Because we know the story, right?
Are two sources enough?
Well,
I don't know. 109th Pennsylvania and the 5th Ohio.
I don't remember exactly where they are in relation to each other. Are they close by?
They're both on Culp's Hill.
No, I know that.
One is in Kane's Brigade, and the other they're both Kane, aren't they? No, not the 5th Ohio. I don't know, but they're both in the same vicinity.
Okay.
Of
So close enough where one of them could have been like, "Hey, let's make up this story."
No.
Right. So they probably would have both seen the same thing.
You can edit this out, but other types of monuments that you might think of, John, for the African American experience?
Yeah, that's I'd have to think.
Okay, well, let me throw some, and you kind of say, "Well, no, that wouldn't work," or "That would work." Where Mag Palm's rental property was, looking down the Emmitsburg Pike to see if there's any more slave catchers coming up.
Yeah.
Maybe at the entrance of the Baltimore Pike entrance to the visitor center, a generic but African American teamster to reflect, I don't know how many thousands of teamsters that were African Americans behind the Union lines.
That's
here.
right. Yep.
Or a similar one at the amphitheater behind the Confederate lines, reflecting the, I think the number you quoted earlier was 8,000 to 10,000. I think you got that from Kent Masterson Brown's book of teamsters for the blacks, or for the South, but mostly blacks. Or Lydia Smith.
Yeah.
Who, as I understand it, I think I'm getting this from Creighton, was going to hospitals in the outlying areas after the battle and not denying her aid to the Confederates that were in the hospitals. And Lydia Smith is an African American. Those of you who watched the movie, Spielberg's movie on Lincoln a few years ago, will recognize her as Thaddeus Stevens, local congressman here. As first you think she's his housekeeper when she first appears on the movie, but then you realize that they're sleeping together. That this is a husband-wife kind of situation, at least a common law situation. So anyway, I don't know what you think about those ideas for.
It's a compelling question. Absolutely. One more thing. Certainly with all these stories, with all these narratives, it's just to tell another part of this story here at Gettysburg. So that was certainly what kind of piqued my interest in examining this, and to try to just make the story of what happened here more complete picture. So,
No, and I'm glad you did. I can't wait for your 54th Massachusetts. Oh, Bob's got one more.
Sorry, it's just kind of on that line. I just jotted a few notes down. We were talking before. I know you can edit this out one way or another. So,
okay.
Places today where you can get to see the story a little bit. The Seminary Ridge Museum has at least a room with a book with the names, in some cases pictures, of the people, local people who were involved in uniform for the Union cause, including Randolph Johnson's in that book. And kudos to them for doing something.
Yes.
The Abraham Bryan House has a plaque, a wayside there. The Lincoln Cemetery, though locked, you can walk around it, and you can even see the graves of some of these people that John's talked about, and people who served. Across the street from the Lincoln Cemetery, on Long Lane? On Long Lane, there's a few art exhibits that you could visit, and I'd encourage, if you're listening and coming to Gettysburg, to seek this out. There's a wayside exhibit in front of the Hopkins house. John mentioned the custodian of the vice president of the college. Yeah, right.
That was his
And
nickname.
as I understand it, I think I learned this from you, John, Gettysburg College gave students off
for his funeral. Yeah, that was the second time that they were dismissed the student body as a whole. The first was to attend Lincoln's speech, or the dedication day, and the second was for the funeral of Mr. Hopkins.
Wow.
And then, and of course, the museum today has good stuff about the role of slavery in bringing on the war, and I think they do a much better job balancing off the lost cause influence of the previous museum. But I think my final question for you, John, what is the plan for the Warfield House?
The Warfield House still stands, the original home, the stone house, even though it has been kind of obscured by post-war additions. Those additions are currently being removed bit by bit, part by part. And I'd have to talk to the park, certainly, but I would love for that to become a place to tell Black story.
That would be a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the plan is. All I know is that they are in the first steps. They've done archaeological work out there, and they are now, I think, beginning the process of removing the non-historic parts of the Warfield home. So maybe perhaps down the road it could be a place to tell a more complete story of Gettysburg.
And for those of you who are wondering, that's the house that's basically right in front of the Longstreet Tower.
That's correct.
So if you're on West Confederate and you don't go to the tower, but you turn left towards the peach orchard on what is today the Wheatfield Road eventually, but it was then the Millerstown Crossroads.
Yeah.
It's a stone house with modern additions on your right. Right across the street from another.
There's another one on the left, isn't there?
Yeah, I think that was the Christian Schefferer family, but I'm not positive about that. Mm-hmm. But that would be... I just want to encourage, if you have anything you could do to that, to make that happen as an African-American experience. The foundation last year was asking the Gettysburg Foundation was asking its employees to submit ideas of how to get more people to visit Gettysburg. And I went to the president, not that I'm a foundation employee, but when I heard that, I went to the president of the foundation and suggested that if there was a monument here or something that could draw African-Americans more than they come currently to this place, that might be something too, because their stories has been basically ignored. So
yeah.
And John, thank you so much for bringing people's attention to this whole.
Well, I'm kind of late to the party in a lot of respects because there's been so many that preceded me, like James Paredes, Margaret Creighton, Betty Myers, Harry Matthews, Andrew Dalton, Tim Smith, and Deb McCausland. Who have studied this topic extensively and told these stories, and hopefully they're beginning to resonate more and more and more as the years go by.
Yeah. Well, I went to almost all the lectures last winter, and it's in my top 3. I won't tell you who the other 2 are because I don't want to make it a competition, but this one was one of my favorites, and I can't wait for the one this year about the 54th Massachusetts, and we'll have you come on and talk about that, but I won't release it until after you've done the actual lecture.
It was my favorite lecture.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I even asked John for a copy of his notes right afterwards.
Yeah, I know. And that's what I have here. You send it over to me because it's very good. Anyway, John, thanks for coming by.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for all you do. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Matt.
And thank you all who are listening on Patreon. Talk to you next time.